hopefully. I'd like to thank our program director, Susan Sibilia, for that nice graphic she had of Dan with the lasso and the cowboy hat. But I'd also like to thank Dan for being a good sport about it and having that. If you haven't seen that, you should check out the Politics Forum webpage. It's worth a look before Dan forces that to come down. But I thought you looked good in a cowboy hat. Maybe.
I'm pretty sure I owned this shirt. Something very similar.
I think it was from Toy Story. Anyhow, so yeah, let's give Dan a nice round of applause.
And so great to see you. And I'm really thrilled to get to be in this wonderful space. I think it's my first time getting a chance to be in front of folks here in this room. And it's a really delightful space. And thank you all for letting me come and speak with you today about the midterm elections. I've been doing a talk like this on midterm election results since way back in 2010, my first fall at TCNJ. And so there's a little soft spot in my heart to give a talk about the midterm elections. It's one of the most distinctive features in the United States that we have midterm elections, so sort of off-cycle elections where the executive is not on the ballot. And it really drives much of what happens in US politics because we think of the president as the top of the ticket, the party leader, really crucial in setting policy in the United States. But so much authority resides in Congress. And then they have this weird midterm election where they're on the ballot and the president isn't. And sometimes you get some set of senators, a third of the senators are up for re-election, and all the seats in the House are up for re-election. And it leads to all sorts of chaos in US politics because you have differential turnout of the groups, right? As the parties wrestle with who can they get to the polls without that top of the ticket item there, the president. So it leads to all sorts of really interesting things. What happened last week? And I have a little footnote here. You can't see it, but left a note for myself that this is sort of what we know right now. And there's a lot we don't know, right? The results are still coming in. The ballots are still being counted. California takes forever. And in fact, the analysis I'm going to show you here doesn't even have California, which is 52 seats in the House, simply because not enough of the vote has been counted there. So there's a lot we don't know, but I think we can start to piece together a little bit about what the lessons are from last week. So this is what kind of happened, we think is happening as we think back about last week's elections. At the very top of the ticket here, the Democrats hold the Senate. They flip Pennsylvania. Fetterman beats Oz in a highly contested Senate race, flipping that seat that was Pat Toomey's seat and was a Republican hold. Democrats might actually gain a seat depending on the Georgia runoff. If Warnock beats Walker in the runoff, they might actually increase their majority in the Senate. Or it could be, Warnock could lose in the runoff, and then the Democrats would be in the same place as they were coming into the election, which is obviously a very important result in of itself, that Democrats remain in control of one of the houses of Congress. Certainly looks like the GOP is going to take the House. And I checked a few minutes ago. The GOP had 217 seats in the U.S. House. You need 218 for a majority. Don't really know how big that majority is going to be. We have to finish counting the ballots. We might have to go through a recount for a couple of the races, as well as deal with ranked choice voting in Alaska to see exactly what happens here for the size of the Republican majority of the House. It will probably be fairly small. We'll come back to that point in a little bit. Their majority could be anywhere from 1 to 5 or 6 seats, which results from a swing from before the election to after the election of anywhere from 6 to maybe 11 or 12 seats. Sort of everything breaks the GOP's way here in these final these final vote counts. Very close margins in the House, some of the closest ever, right? If we're talking about a potential 1 or 2 seat majority, this is a very close election in the US House. Locally, the real big change is that Tom Kean Jr. Won in New Jersey, being incumbent Malinowski, Democrat Malinowski. So the Republicans have 3 seats, and the Democrats hold 9 in New Jersey. This is after a recent round of redistricting, which kind of designed this outcome, right? Where Democrats kind of conceded Malinowski's district, in part hoping to be able to shore up other areas of the state. The rest of the news is pretty much status quo. Lots of close races and not a lot of changing seats in terms of the governorships, right? Dems hold very important races in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and they pick up a very hotly contested governorship in Arizona, while the GOP held in some of their strongholds, also hotly contested races in Georgia, Ohio, and Texas, and they pick up 1 governorship in Nevada.
Oh, the Maryland seat, the governor's seat.
Oh, right, yes, Hogan retired, right. So the Dems also pick up Maryland, right. And then for legislatures, I don't know yet about the Pennsylvania House, but the Dems do pick up a chamber in the Minnesota Senate, and now control both chambers in Minnesota. Pennsylvania, they might pick up 1 of the chambers, so it'd be a split control. Not a lot of change in the states. In fact, this is kind of a historic outcome that a party doesn't lose a single state legislative chamber when during a midterm election, when their their party controls the presidency. And this is a historic kind of achievement for Democrats. So at first blush, it might look like kind of a boring election in the sense that there's not a lot of change that happened last Tuesday. But I want to tell you that that is actually a shocking result. And we should all be very surprised, flabbergasted at the result of this week's election. So 2022, I think, is going to be remembered as a midterm election where the most notable things are what didn't happen. And what do I mean by that? Political scientists like to look at the fundamentals of an election. The different ways we talk about the fundamentals, but one certainly thing we would talk about as a fundamental for a midterm election is presidential approval, right? How do voters feel about the president? Another one would be how's the economy doing? And there are different ways of measuring the economy. We could talk about unemployment rates. We could definitely talk about wages and real disposable income as a way of thinking about whether the economy is booming or contracting, or people are struggling or thriving. And typically when things are going well, the incumbent party, the president's party, does better, right? It's how these fundamentals generally work. Other things that might be considered a fundamental would be how large the existing majorities are in, say, the House of Representatives, how many seats are up for election in the Senate, how long a party has been in power, and so on. A sort of baseline reactions that really aren't based on public opinion polling or individual races, that sort of set the baseline for an election. Well, here's one of the most fundamental aspects of American politics. The president's party nearly always loses seats in the House. And it often loses a lot of seats in the House of Representatives. It's easier to talk about the House because the Senate, they're not always up, not every Senate seat's up for election every 2 years, right? So it kind of depends on what the calendar happens to be for how that changes control of the Senate. But for the House, you often see the president's party lose seats. In fact, there are only 2 instances in the last, since the 1940s, even actually, you can even go back further than that. that the president's party didn't lose seats in the House. It's as, reliable as the sun rising in the morning, almost, right? The president's party loses seats. The only exceptions here are Clinton and the Democrats in 1998. This is sort of during the height of the Clinton sex scandal in 98. And really after since the Republicans have took the majority in 94 of the House. So sort of a unique situation. And then the Republicans in 2002 after 9/11, the election following 9/11, right? With very high Bush approval rating and a very unique environment. Otherwise, the president's party loses seats. And sometimes loses a lot of seats. There's Obama and the Democrats in 2010, really wave election. And we have various models for thinking about how or why the president's party typically loses these seats. One way is as a view of elections as a referendum. And the voters think about the midterm as a way of responding to or showing how they feel about the president and the leadership of the country. And typically this referendum idea would say that when times are good and people are happy about the direction of the country, when they're happy about the leadership of the presidential administration, you'll reward that incumbent party by not taking away as many seats, right? They always lose some, but maybe not as many. Of course, if the times are bad economy, unliked president, then that party might lose a lot of seats. Another way of thinking about it, this midterm seat loss, is through the surge and decline theory. And this idea, set up by Campbell and many others, suggests that the president's party loses seats not because voters are dissatisfied with the incumbent administration, but instead the mobilization efforts that happened in the presidential election, that coalition that was built to win that presidential election, and by definition they won, because the president is not at the ballot, some part of that coalition is not brought to the polls, right? So you have the surge during the presidential election year, where that coalition is built through the presidential election campaign to win the presidency on this national election. And then when the president is off the ballot, some portion fall away. That's the decline in the surge and decline theory. And it helps explain why almost always the president's party loses seats. Sometimes this is known as coattails effect. Another idea suggests that voters want balance. They respond in some way as a thermostatic relationship with politics. So when people win elections and they start doing things in government, shift policy to be more liberal or to be more conservative, that voters respond by saying, oh, that was great. I was really happy that you were there and doing that thing. That's enough. Now we need some more divided government. Let's put the brakes on whatever change is happening. And there's lots of good evidence that as policy change happens, public opinion moves away from the party of the president, supporting the opposition, and then leading to success for the opposition party. Okay, in this case, for this election year, would be the Republicans. So we have referendum, surge and decline, and then some sort of balancing or a thermostatic public opinion response to the election. I'm going to focus on the referendum because I think it's easiest to get the data over time on this explanation. But we can look here at presidential approval on the scatter plot. And oh, did I mess with the Zoom? Oh, I did. Oh no. Sorry, Zoom people. Here's a scatter plot with a best fit line Oh, I didn't share my screen, did I? That's what I did. I did. Okay, sorry.
We'll get that Zoom thing right one of these.
One of these years, I'll learn how to use it. So here's a scatter plot that just takes a look at president's approval. Now, historically, we've been using the Gallup series just because it's the oldest, right? It goes back farthest in time. And if you take the last Gallup poll before the election, this is usually done in late October, and you plot it against the seat change in the House for the president's party, it's a pretty strong relationship. Pretty strong relationship where the less popular you are as a president, the more your party loses in the midterm election. The more seats you lose in the midterm election. Anybody know what Biden's approval rating was coming in?
40?
40. The last Gallup poll has him at 40. Now, some polls a little bit higher, right? But we're talking about low 40s, right? So prediction from approval would put the Democrats losing at least 40 seats in the House based on Biden's performance. I built a little model that I'm not going to show you here, but you can take the fundamentals, including presidential approval. Oh no, it's still not working. You take the fundamentals, including presidential approval, and the size of the existing majorities in the House, and change in real disposable income per capita, so the economy, which has also not been very good, right, for the Democrats, and predict the seat share or the seat change across the midterm election years. And this graph shows you the blue dots are the actual seat changes. Right, this is what blue dots are what happened. The gray dots are what this model would predict would happen based on presidential approval, change in real disposable income per capita, and then change in sort of how overextended the party is in terms of numbers of seats. And this model explains about 70% of the variation in midterm seat change. So it's a pretty good model given the small number of cases that we have to work with here. We don't know yet how many seats the Democrats lost, but this model, again, not the only way of doing this, would predict the Democrats would lose 60 seats in the House. Now, maybe we could do a different model. We're using unemployment instead of real, just a change in real disposable income per capita. Maybe it wouldn't look as bad for Biden. But the fundamentals would say we would expect a massive seat loss for Democrats. And a very likely possibility here is that they're only losing 5 to 10 seats. It'd be easily the worst performance in this model in 100 years, right? If we had public opinion data going back further in time, right? It's really shocking. It's really shocking. Okay, let's look at some election results. And I want to add the caveat here that I just pulled this off of news sites. These are not official results, and you should not do that, right? You should wait until the official results are released. So this could all be wrong, but this is sort of the best data that I think we have at this second. So it's what I'm going to use. So let's take a look here. Here's a plot. On the x-axis, we have Biden's percent of the two-party presidential votes. So just looking at votes for Biden or Trump in 2020. This is calculated at the congressional district level. So we've looked at the new boundaries. I didn't, but Daily Cost did. Calculated the presidential vote inside the new boundaries, And that's what's on the x-axis, what's going to be on the x-axis, okay? On the y-axis would be how well House Democrats did as a percentage of the two-party vote. Looking at just House Democrats versus Republicans, Republican candidates here. This is their vote share. I've dropped instances in which only one party is running a candidate, the other party isn't, or the second major candidate might be an independent or a Green Party or a Libertarian. Those are not on this graph. So just two-party competitive seats. We might say, because it's a midterm, and maybe we would have a surge and decline idea or a referendum, that we'd see a uniform party swing where Democrats are doing worse everywhere, right? And maybe doing worse everywhere on a regular basis or on a consistent way across the graph. This solid line shows you what would happen if the House Democrat performed equal to Biden. Of course, that's a great standard because Biden won the presidency across the country, right? So typically, if you can match your president's performance, you're doing pretty well, right? And your party's gonna win a lot of elections. So the black line, solid line, shows if the Democratic candidate is matching Biden. And conversely, the Republicans matching Trump. And then if you're seeing the Republicans outperform Democrats in a uniform way, those dashed lines show you what we would see on the scatter plot, right? A 5-point swing towards Republicans, you'll see a cluster of dots along that line. 10-point would be that second line. Okay. So this is reality. This is what happened, or at least what we think happened based on some incomplete votes and no California, no Alaska and Maine and so on. We see some of that uniform swing, right? A lot of dots along just below this Biden line. It's 1-to-1 Biden to House Dem line. But I'll just point out that it looks like Republicans are doing really well in Republican-leaning districts, right? They're doing a little bit better, sometimes even reaching maybe a 10-point swing, right? But certainly, meeting that 5-point swing. Not as clear in our marginal districts that uniform swing is happening. In fact, in many districts, the House Democrats are even outperforming the Biden vote. And then as we get further out into here, House Democrats are maybe doing almost as well as Biden, maybe a little bit worse. Okay. We could also pull out the incumbents and see how the incumbent partisans are doing. So these Loess plots here show you the average relationship between the Biden vote in the district and how the House race went in 2022. The red lines show races in which there's a GOP incumbent, and the blue lines show races in which there is a Democratic incumbent. Obviously, everything's close, everything's related to partisanship, right? So it's all directly related to how well Biden and Trump did in these districts, the party, makeup of the districts. But again, I'll just point to these marginal districts, these areas that are competitive, and Democrats are matching on average what Biden did in these competitive districts, and Republicans are when they're an incumbent on average, they're pulling down the vote share towards the Republican candidates. So incumbency here is mattering in these marginal districts. And Democratic districts, they're able to hold, they're able to match what Biden got, maybe even improve on it a little bit. The Republican districts, you see a larger swing toward the Republican Party. Incumbency seems to be mattering here. And you definitely do see just a little bit hint of a difference here where Democrats are doing better in more Democratic districts. Republicans are having more of that typical uniform swing in Republican districts. Okay, so what explains the findings that we see here? Well, one potential explanation is redistricting. And I think it's a little bit early yet to know exactly how redistricting mattered, in part because we don't have precinct level data yet. We'll get that over time, and we'll be able to look at this more closely. But one thing that redistricting typically does, by the way, for those of you who don't know, redistricting is the process by which we redraw congressional district boundaries to adjust for population changes after the census. So the census comes out, in 2020, and then 2022, this past week, was our first election with new district boundaries. Who gets to draw those lines matters a lot, and that changes by state. In lots of places, the party in control of the state government, and particularly the legislature, gets to draw congressional district boundaries. You might say that's unfair, and it is. It's problematic, but that's the way it works in many places. What often happens, particularly if you have divided government, is that one consequence of redistricting is that we have reduced numbers of competitive elections as the parties draw the boundaries to protect their vulnerable incumbents, right? So sometimes referred to as incumbent protection gerrymanders. It's a very oftentimes a consequence of redistricting, and particularly if the parties have undergone a shift in vote share and they're not sure what's going to happen throughout the decade, and they want to make sure they can lock in their gains from recent changes in the vote, which is what's been happening in the United States. So the parties are seeing a new electoral map. They've drawn, when they can, districts to sort of protect incumbents that are vulnerable, and probably reducing competition overall. Just as a note, it doesn't happen, it's only once every 20 years that you get a midterm election and a redistricting election year happening at the same time. And the last time this happened was 2002, which was the best showing for any president. Now, we typically think about that being due to 9/11. But maybe something to keep in the back of our minds, that maybe this also has to do with the fact that this is a midterm election year with the first election in that new redistricting cycle. So here's just a little piece of evidence for this idea that maybe it's the new districts that have not necessarily biased the direction to Republicans or Democrats, but have reduced competition, reduced the number of competitive districts, and strengthened some vulnerable incumbents. And this is the Biden vote, percent of two-party vote. So over here on the left would be Republican districts. Over here on the right would be Democratic districts. And these are the old district boundaries before they were redrawn using this presidential vote in 2020. It's not quite a normal distribution here. Here's 50, right? So here's sort of the middle of the distribution. Here's what happened in our same calculation of the Biden two-party vote, but using our new district boundaries. And you can just kind of see this added gap here in between the marginal Democratic districts and the marginal Republican districts. So just a little bit of evidence, and maybe the parties are moving, tweaking those boundaries to help protect vulnerable incumbents, which particularly in the Democratic side might have been enough to stop that swing to the Republicans from washing out a bunch of Democratic seats, right? So maybe if the redistricting didn't happen, and we're using the old maps, maybe you lose another 10 or 15 seats, right? That Democrats were able to protect.
And maybe another way to show that might be to think of New Jersey's changes. So Andy
Exactly.
Kim gave some of his Republican
Yeah.
areas to Malinowski. I think Mikey Sherrill did too,
Mm-hmm.
making those two Democrats safer at the expense of Malinowski. And I think that Smith and Van Drew also picked up Republican areas, so they swapped.
Exactly. That's exactly right. So that was the purpose of so New Jersey, there's the parties both submit a redistricting plan. And there's a tiebreaker, a congressional district tiebreaker. And that person has to either choose the Republican map or the Democratic map. And this election cycle, that person chose the Democratic map. This was a controversial decision. But what the Democrats had really tried to do was they gave up Malinowski to solidify their gains everywhere else. And that's what happened, right? They didn't lose any other seats, even though they could have, right? Given the electoral environment. You know, this is another potential explanation. Maybe it's something else that has to do with incumbency or candidates or how the campaigns are functioning. We're seeing a lot of tight races sort of being able to be held by the parties that control them by and large. I just thought that'd be interesting to look at the incumbency advantage here in a quick little model where I've allowed the incumbency advantage to vary by how competitive the district is. So based on the presidential vote. And on the left one here, we have Democrats. Each of these dots represent an estimate of the size of the benefit that you get towards Democrats if you were an incumbent, okay? And then it varies, allowing it to vary by the competitiveness of the seat. So here are seats in which Republicans are sort of in the majority, right? Trump beat Biden here, but by a little bit. So these are competitive, kind of enemy territory if you're a Democrat, right? But the incumbency advantage in such districts is almost 3 points, not quite 3 points for Democratic incumbents. They're doing the best in these suitable or unfriendly territory, right? And then as you get toward a safe win, that advantage goes away. Now, there's lots of reasons for why you might see a pattern like this, right? It could be mobilization efforts. It could be advertisement from the parties, right? Really focusing on keeping those seats that you think that you can win, right? It could be candidate recruitment and sort of finding those talented folks and making sure that that you have them and they're running and they didn't drop out. There could be lots of reasons why you would get an effect like this that is largest in marginal districts and then shrinks as you go away. That's certainly what we see for both parties. Democrats get an advantage when they are running their incumbent. Republicans get an advantage when they're running their incumbent. And in fact, the Republican advantage is even larger in marginal districts, right? So this is not a story of oh, how amazing the Democrats are. Republicans are doing even better. Their incumbency advantage is higher in these tight and unfriendly or competitive districts. Another part of the story could be targeting of mobilization efforts, get out the vote efforts, advertisements, campaign effects here. As I've been talking to people, I think what people really want to know is, what about real policy issues? What about Dobbs? What about abortion rights and access? What about the youth vote? driven by either abortion or student loan forgiveness. Republicans certainly have been running lots of ads, trying to get people to think about crime or immigration issues instead of abortion and other policies. Maybe that had something to do with it. I don't think we know. I think it's going to be a little while before we know. One thing that you can see is that if you were to estimate a model like this and then see, which states differ from what's been sort of been happening, you do see states like Michigan, which had a referendum on the ballot, a constitutional amendment that would safeguard abortion. Michigan was a great case point for Democrats, holding the governorship. The abortion ballot amendment passed, and they did well down ballot too. So maybe, right? Maybe it was an issue like abortion, but I think we need more data before we know that for sure. And one thing that I think the way we should approach issues like these is to think about how that might relate to the broader theories that underpin voting. And in this case, the main argument for Dobbs in particular as being decisive here would be that maybe that took a little bit of the sting out of the thermostatic public opinion, right? Maybe the swing against Democrats and towards Republicans, because policy has changed towards Democrats, maybe that has stopped, or at least stopped partially, because of this very important, very large change in the opposite direction towards conservatives and away from the liberal position. So that's possible. Another hot topic here is about sort of the health of democracy and how unpopular election deniers are, or maybe how unpopular Trumpism is. Gosh, guys, I don't know. I think it's pretty clear after a couple election cycles that Trumpism and sort of extreme Trumpism probably hurts you on the ballot, but not by that much, just a little bit. And there's some evidence that the secretaries of state that were election deniers lost, right, and actually performed worse than some other, other members, governors or other folks. So, yeah, I think this was a good outcome for democracy. They were not electing people to run elections who believe in conspiracy theories. That's good. I would not take this as a full-throated defense of democracy or rejection of populist Trumpism. And I think that if regular people see that, I don't know, I'd be very skeptical that we have much evidence here. So we'll see, but it wasn't a bad outcome for democracy or sort of rejecting election deniers, but it wasn't a full-throated defeat of that either. And then, lastly, there's been a lot of talk after 2020 about some changing, actually 2016, about shifting party coalitions and the shifting areas of support for the parties. Sort of the exchange in particular of educated urban or suburban whites toward the Democratic Party, and then the solidification of the movement of lower educated and more rural whites out of the party and toward Republicans. I don't see any evidence here that's not happening anymore. Like, I think that's probably still happening, but we still need more data on that. And then another big question from 2020 is, what about Latino and Latina voters, and what about African-American voters? Is the GOP making real gains there? And I don't think we know that yet either. I'm pretty hesitant about the exit polls. So I think we'll just have to see about what's happening to the party coalitions and look at that more closely when we get some better data. Okay, what now? So I guess to sort of sum up what I think happened, I think 2022 represents a crystallization of the changes we've been seeing really from that 2020 era. So a lot of the changes that we saw in the party system, shifting areas of support, close elections, high intensity, high turnout, high negative partisanship where you really dislike that other party. Yeah, all of that is just here. It's just here to stay. And the longer elections are shaped by that, the harder it is to sort of break out of that cycle. I think that's the kind of the new era that we're in. The parties have adjusted. They've found their voters, and then sort of we're fighting over this very narrow part of ground in the United States over and over again in multiple elections, and we're seeing a lot of similar election results. Now, what's notable here is, again, we didn't expect to see the same result this time. We expected something different. So that is interesting. Sorry, I messed up the slide, but I would say the one thing that's coming out of this that is perhaps extra surprising is maybe Democrats are feeling good because of what didn't happen. Republicans, this is a crisis. And it's not a crisis because you're getting blown out. It's a crisis because it's been 3 elections in a row, maybe even 4, if you're counting the fact that you lost the popular vote in the Clinton Trump election, in which you have high turnout, highly competitive elections, your base is as energized as it can be, and you're still losing, right? So that's a crisis. And especially, and probably I would say this is the worst for Republicans. This election was the worst, because this is the one they expected to really get control of Congress. And they didn't get it. And it's going to be a lot of conflict inside the party, desperation time. I was thinking about that quote from the French Revolution about the revolution, like Saturn, devours its children, right? You might be entering into the devouring the children of the Trump revolution portion of the party system here, where the fight over who gets the party now and what is the party for, if the party leaders truly believe, right, they can't win an election, a national election, based on what they've been doing, then there's going to be, a drawn-out fight for who gets to decide what comes next. And it's starting, but we'll have to see and pay attention to see what happens and who wins. So that's the potential civil war that the conservatives are already threatening. They're trying to take the power away from the Speaker of the House and so on. And it's going to be chaos in the House. It is going to be chaos. Just as a sort of wrapping up here, people die in the House all the time. They always die. They're old, and they, there's 435 of them. They retire. They get sick. People die. You never get through a session of Congress without losing, several members. But what happens if the House, the Republican majority is 1 or 2 members? You could see a speaker change before the next election. You could see party control of the House change. Even if it doesn't happen, the Republicans lose control based off of someone, dying or resigning or something, or a scandal. There's, every member could be the deciding vote, or every Republican caucus member could be the deciding vote to lose the majority, right? They could side with Democrats for anything. So party discipline, which was almost impossible for Republicans in the House before this, is going to be, probably really difficult now. Any group could take the party hostage to make demands. It's going to be bad. There are a bunch of bills the House has to pass to keep government running, to keep kind of life moving, and there's going to be more House members in the Republican caucus that don't want those bills to pass than the Republicans have leftover seats to pass legislation. So it's going to be crazy, and that's not going to be good for us, and it's not going to be good for Republicans overall. Okay, I think that's it for me. I am happy to answer questions. Yeah.
Thank you for coming and speaking with us. I was thinking about maybe the impacts, and I was wondering if you thought that maybe overconfidence might have been one of the impacts, in that there was so much kind of red wave campaigning that might have actually incentivized Democrats to go out and vote because they saw their vote as more urgent, and then maybe Republicans saw their vote as less necessary. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I do think that one aspect I didn't touch on with the issues is that I think if you're a Democrat, these issues, both the democracy and sort of election deniers and abortion, that's 5-alarm territory if you're a Democrat, right? About we have to get to the polls and we have to vote, and it's absolutely crucial. And I think by and large that happened. I did play around with some turnout models, but again, I want to say these aren't the full results, so who knows what the actual results could be. But it looks like to me, if you look at just the races in which the votes have all been counted or nearly all of them been counted, it looks like Republicans held on to their presidential vote better than Democrats, which was sort of explained because we think about Democrats as sort of having a less reliable voters in general, and you see that in these numbers. So maybe, but I don't think there's a lot of evidence here for Republicans not coming to the polls. That's my point. It looks like they turned out really well. Democrats turned out really well too. They just happened to turn out in slightly better numbers in the exact places they really needed it. And maybe that's, instrumental vote, the youth vote recognizing or something, the importance of your vote in the right places, perhaps. Mike.
Hi, Dr. Bowen. So I'm basing my question, I guess, off a New York Times map. So I understand the bias, but you will.
Yeah.
So there was a map specifically where there was like arrows, like blue and red, and they were showing the percentage of the vote that went to the 2020 election in comparison to this election.
Yeah.
And it showed states like Missouri and like Pennsylvania, where they were red in some of those areas, but they were less red. Is what I understood from it. What do you think explains that in like these historical red areas? Do you think it's turnout or just the Dobbs, the abortion issue?
I think that's a great question, Mike. And I've been thinking about this because I saw the same map you're talking about. I think Oklahoma is one of the largest states where you see a swing towards Democrats. I don't think we know. And the hard part about making those comparisons is that we don't have the top of the ticket, right? So there's no president, there's no one person that's on the ballot everywhere. So you have different candidates running. You'll get a different map like that, depending if you're looking at governor races or Senate races. I would encourage us to say, this is sort of a unique election. And it looks like different things are happening in different places. And we're just going to have to wait and do more study to figure out what that is. It could be abortion. It could be candidate effects. You know, it looks like places like Michigan and Oklahoma and Pennsylvania are, you know, swinging a little bit to Democrat more than you'd expect. And then New York and Florida swinging toward Republicans, more like a typical midterm. And I don't think we know. And, you know, and you're seeing lots of ideas floated out there, but they all have to be tested individually. I don't have a speculation yet. Do you have one? It's kind of bizarre, right, to be honest.
I think like you mentioned Oklahoma. I think like there was a case specifically with Native Americans and their like complete distrust in the governor. And I think I just know that because I've read up a lot on it a lot. So that maybe.
Yeah, and you know, one thing that all these sort of different patterns might show is that it could be race specific or candidate specific factors could be driving that, right? But in order to know that, we have to test that against other potential factors like public opinion or something. So we just need to get better data. Yeah.
Also have questions.
Oh, I have a question on the Zoom. Okay, go ahead.
Not interrupt.
Do you think there's an argument that the sort of familiarity that we got with mail-in and early voting in 2020 helped out or influenced at all the results of this midterm?
Well, that's a great question. You know, the big advantage for mail-in voting is that reliable voters can vote more easily, right? So when things come up on election day, you've still voted because you've already mailed in your ballot. So that's, you know, those convenience voting reforms typically help the kinds of people who are likely to vote. It makes it so that they don't drop off, which is always why it's crazy that Republicans don't embrace mail-in voting. It's just, it was they did in the past, right? This is a Trump era thing because it helped Trump for in the 2020 election, right? That's all this is about. And the Republicans need to ditch that perspective and get behind mail-in voting because you want to get and early voting because you want to get your supporters to the polls. So I don't know. That's another question that we're going to have to see better data on. As you do have convenience voting, though, I mean, it sort of supports this high turnout model that we're seeing. So maybe a little bit of extra benefit on turnout. Jordan?
I know exit polls are not like super duper accurate, but one thing that like really shocked me was that voters who like slightly disapprove of Joe Biden voted for Democrats in these elections, 49%, 48%. You think that like the disapproval we see of Joe Biden in these polls kind of doesn't really accurately reflect how voters are thinking, and maybe the strongly approved that we saw for Donald Trump was more indicative of like voters disliking Trump more than it is of them disliking Biden right now?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I actually wonder as I was doing these models for presidential approval, like how relevant presidential approval is right now, because you know with negative partisanship, you sort of automatically have the out party who wasn't going to vote for your candidate, the Democrats. The Republicans were going to vote for the Democrat candidates anyway, by and large. But they're all saying no, we don't like Joe Biden. And in previous generations and at different times in American politics, maybe some of those people would have said, yeah, I think Biden's doing okay, doing a good job. And you're right that the reaction, the polls aren't picking up sort of strength of reaction. Although I'm pretty confident that Biden is not popular among Republicans. Like they are pretty upset about Biden. So I think what really matters here is what's happening to the independents. And is 40% approval rating indicative of how independents feel about Democrats and how independents feel about Biden. And that they may not be thrilled, but maybe they still like them better than the Republicans, for example. But there's a big question there, I think, about what do we think about presidential approval and what's it actually telling us anymore now that it's barely changing and it's so driven by partisanship. Chris.
I've been thinking about this for a while since the midterms happened. Do you think there's any like saliency, like argument of like gubernatorial coattails in midterm elections? Because I saw like at least seeing like Lee Zeldin doing fairly well in New York, and then Ron DeSantis doing fairly well in Florida. They were one of the biggest strongholds for Republicans and the biggest flips, especially in New York, for Republicans. So do you think there's any salient to the issue or the argument of like gubernatorial coattails in midterm elections?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think so. And even senatorial, because whatever's on top of the ticket, the highest profile race is going to be driving the most attention. And you might have, people who are kind of on the fence about voting who now will come to the polls because of that competitive Senate race or gubernatorial race. And because of that, it will probably impact down ballot races. I know that New York Democrats certainly feel that they were harmed by the governor's race. So, I think we probably should listen to them when they say that kind of thing, right? And likewise, when we have races in New Jersey on off-year elections, state legislators certainly believe that their election, their careers are in part determined by who's on the top of the ticket. So yeah, I think so. Questions from the chat. Dr. Shartok asks about New York redistricting. Yeah, so what happened in New York, if I remember correctly, is that the New York gerrymander, Democratic gerrymander, was thrown out by the New York Supreme Court, and a bunch of the seats, maybe 4, somebody probably knows the answer to this, of those seats were appointed by Andrew Cuomo, and they were either Republicans or more conservative justices. And so Cuomo is being sort of blamed for this map being thrown out. Jonathan Service was appointed, who's a political scientist, was appointed as a special, not prosecutor, special master to redraw the district boundaries. And he made a very party fair, unbiased map. If you look at the ratings, it's a pretty even map. But Democrats won the gerrymander. And of course, if they had a gerrymander there, then they may have held the House. So you could credit Cuomo, you could blame Cuomo. It depends on your perspective, I guess, about New York. Dr. Cho asks about what do the results mean for forecasting the next elections. The one thing that's a great question. I do think that there are some really interesting results here for people who are in the process of forecasting. Because of how poorly this fundamentals model works in this election cycle. And maybe that's going to be a one-time thing, or maybe it's going to be a sort of an enduring feature going forward for a little while. One very interesting outcome is that the polls weren't wrong this year. We sort of based on the fundamentals, we sort of expected that we must have these correlated errors again, where we're missing some Republican pocket of voters. We're going to come to the midterm and vote, and then we're going to see this swing towards the Republicans. But the polls weren't wrong. Again, we'll know better when the final vote tallies are there and be able to compare. But the generic ballot showed a very competitive race between the Democrats and Republicans. A lot of the individual state races were well predicted, it looks like, from the polling. No evidence of a, missing this secret pocket of Republican voters somewhere. So polling looks good and the sort of fundamentals, forecasting fundamentals look bad. And we'll just keep calibrating and try to do better next time. Thanks.
I was wondering if you might comment on what strikes me as maybe one of the more disappointing races for Democrats in the Senate, and that's in Ohio, where there was no incumbent, but JD Vance, the Republican candidate, beat Tim Ryan pretty handily. I think the mainstream media narrative of this is kind of just Ohio's red now.
Yeah.
And it strikes me as a little unsatisfying. Especially because we know Ohio has arguably the most progressive senator in the Democratic caucus, Sherrod Brown, as their other member representation in the Senate, who I think won by about 10 points in 2018, his last election. So in going beyond just Ohio's red now, does the scholarship on political behavior and voting behavior and political science offer us a way of thinking about a state like Ohio, which now has perhaps with JD Vance, one of the more deeply conservative and Trumpist members of the Senate, and also one of the most progressive senators in Sherrod Brown?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, my initial reaction was going to say, well, Ohio's red.
Right.
Ohio today is not the Ohio of old. But to your second question, and Florida today is not the Florida of 2000 either. So the trends in sort of the shifting party coalitions have moved both of those states that we sort of have this conception of as swing states as really pretty solidly Republican. But getting to your question about sort of this disjointed representation of Senate seats. And I believe the scholarship basically says it's the vast majority of that. I mean, obviously incumbency matters here. Once you're in, you can sort of, get a couple of extra percentage points from being an incumbent, particularly in the Senate seat, it's a higher profile. But the real issue is election time, right? 2018 is a very different environment than 2022. And if you're lucky, you can get into office when the swings are towards your party, and then develop a representation, a reputation for being a good senator and being smart and competent, gives you a couple extra percentages on that vote total. Avoid mistakes and sort of hope that you don't land your election on those off years where the swings are against your party. And that's most of the answer. Unfortunately, I mean, it's not very insightful, but I think that's most of it. Mike, there will probably should stop here pretty soon, I think. Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
So a lot of states put protection of abortion on their constitution through the ballot measures. I don't know if there's any historical examples. I know that you can't predict it for after now because there's not a lot of data on it. But do you think that now that that's not an issue for Democrats in that state, that they'll be doing as well? I know, like specifically Michigan, where a lot of there's a Republican governor that won, but they still added abortion to their constitution, where that might not be an issue for Democrats anymore to run on or campaign on.
Well, but the Democratic governor, Whitmer, right? Won in Michigan. And there's really good evidence that ballot initiatives can, well, number one, that they increase turnout, and number two, they can, drive support for the sides of this sort of liberal conservative sides that, for down ballot races, right? So, back in the early 2000s, Republicans were offering, constitutional amendments to ban gay marriage, in part to, yes, get their preferred policy, but as much to drive turnout for Republicans. And then you see Democrats do that with marijuana legalization and minimum wage increases, and now abortion, protections. So I think it's sort of a tried and true party tactic that's successful for states that have the initiative process. Now, whether that's going to take steam out of Democrats later, I kind of doubt it, but I do think it helped them in this one-off race. So I do think that's probably part of the explanation for why Michigan was such a good outcome for Democrats. Folks, I think we should probably stop there so you can get to the rest of your classes. Thank you so much for spending the hour with me, and hope you have a great rest of your day.